In each case the figure is that of a man, 4 cubits and a span high, with a spear in his right hand and a bow in his left, the rest of his costume being likewise half Egyptian, half Ethiopian. There's an inscription across the breast from shoulder to shoulder in the sacred character of Egypt, which says, "With my own shoulders I conquered this land." The conqueror doesn't tell who he is or whence he comes, though elsewhere Sesostris records these facts. Hence it has been imagined by some of those who've seen these forms that they are figures of Memnon, but such as think so err very widely from the truth. This Sesostris, the priests went on to say, upon his return home, accompanied by vast multitudes of the people whose countries he had subdued, was received by his brother, whom he had made viceroy of Egypt on his departure at Daphne, near Pelusium, and invited by him to a banquet which he attended together with his sons. Then his brother piled a quantity of wood all round the building, and having so done, set it alight. Sesostris, discovering what had happened, took counsel instantly with his wife, who had accompanied him to the feast, and was advised by her to lay 2 of their 6 sons upon the fire, and so make a bridge across the flames, whereby the rest might effect their escape. Sesostris did as she recommended, and thus, while 2 of his sons were burnt to death, he himself and his other children were saved. The king then returned to his own land and took vengeance upon his brother, after which he proceeded to make use of the multitudes whom he had brought with him from the conquered countries, partly to drag the huge masses of stone which were moved in the course of his reign to the temple of Hephaestus, partly to dig the numerous canals with which the whole of Egypt is intersected. By these forced labours the entire face of the country was changed. For whereas Egypt had formerly been a region suited both for horses and carriages, henceforth it became entirely unfit for either. Though a flat country throughout its whole extent, it's now unfit for either horse or carriage, being cut up by the canals, which are extremely numerous, and run in all directions. The king's object was to supply Nile water to the inhabitants of the towns situated in the mid-country, and not lying upon the river, for previously they had been obliged, after the subsidence of the floods, to drink of brackish water, which they obtained from wells. Sesostris also, they declared, made a division of the soil of Egypt among the inhabitants, assigning square plots of ground of equal size to all, and obtaining his chief revenue from the rent which the holders were required to pay him year by year. If the river carried away any portion of a man's lot, he appeared before the king and related what had happened, upon which the king sent persons to examine and determine by measurement the exact extent of the loss, and thenceforth only such a rent was demanded of him as was proportionate to the reduced size of his land. From this practice I think geometry first came to be known in Egypt, whence it passed into Greece. The sundial, however, and the gnomon, with the division of the day into 12 parts, were received by the Greeks from the Babylonians. Sesostris was king not only of Egypt, but also of Ethiopia. He was the only Egyptian monarch who ever ruled over the latter country. He left as memorials of his reign the stone statues which stand in front of the temple of Hephaestus, 2 of which, representing himself and his wife, are 30 cubits in height, while the remaining 4, which represent his sons, are 20 cubits. These are the statues in front of which the priest of Hephaestus, very many years afterwards, wouldn't allow Darius the Persian to place a statue of himself, because, he said, Darius hadn't equalled the achievements of Sesostris the Egyptian. For while Sesostris had subdued to the full as many nations as ever Darius had brought under, he had likewise conquered the Scythians, whom Darius had failed to master. It wasn't fair, therefore, that he should erect his statue in front of the offerings of a king whose deeds he had been unable to surpass. Darius, they say, pardoned the freedom of this speech. On the death of Sesostris, his son Pharaon, the priest said, mounted the throne. He undertook no warlike expeditions, being struck with blindness, owing to the following circumstance. The river had swollen to the unusual height of 18 cubits, and had overflowed all the fields, when, a sudden wind arising, the water rose in great waves. Then the king, in a spirit of impious violence, seized his spear and hurled it into the strong eddies of the stream. Instantly he was smitten with disease of the eyes, from which, after a little while, he became blind, continuing without the power of vision for 10 years. At last, in the 11th year, an oracular announcement reached him from the city of book2, to the effect that the time of his punishment had run out, and he should recover his sight by washing his eyes with urine. He must find a woman who had been faithful to her husband, and had never preferred to him another man. The king therefore first of all made trial of his wife, but to no purpose. He continued as blind as before. So he made the experiment with other women, until at length he succeeded, and in this way recovered his sight. Hereupon he assembled all the women except the last, and bringing them to the city which now bears the name of Erythrabolus, red soil, he there burnt them all, together with the place itself. The woman to whom he owed his cure he married, and after his recovery was complete, he presented offerings to all the temples of any note, among which the best worthy of mention are the 2 stone obelisks which he gave to the temple of the sun. These are magnificent works. Each is made of a single stone, 8 cubits broad and 100 cubits in height. Phaeron, they said, was succeeded by a man of Memphis, whose name in the language of the Greeks was Proteus. There's a sacred precinct of this king in Memphis, which is very beautiful and richly adorned, situated south of the great temple of Hephaestus. Phoenicians from the city of Tyre dwell all round this precinct, and the whole place is known by the name of the Camp of the Tyrians. Within the enclosure stands a temple which is called that of Aphrodite the Stranger. I conjecture the building to have been erected to Helen, the daughter of Tyndarus, first because she, as I've heard say, passed some time at the court of Proteus, and secondly because the temple is dedicated to Aphrodite the Stranger, for among all the many temples of Aphrodite there is no other where the goddess bears this title. The priests, in answer to my inquiries on the subject of Helen, informed me of the following particulars. When Alexander had carried off Helen from Sparta, he took ship and sailed homewards. On his way across the Aegean, a gale arose, which drove him from his course and took him down to the Sea of Egypt. Hence, as the wind didn't abate, he was carried on to the coast, when he went ashore, landing at the salt pans in that mouth of the Nile, which is now called the Canobic. At this place there stood upon the shore a temple, which still exists, dedicated to Heracles. If a slave runs away from his master, and taking sanctuary at this shrine, gives himself up to the god, and receives certain sacred marks upon his person, whosoever his master may be, he cannot lay hand on him. This law still remained unchanged to my time. Hearing therefore of the custom of the place, the attendants of Alexander deserted him, and fled to the temple, where they sat as suppliants. While there, wishing to damage their master, they accused him to the Egyptians, narrating all the circumstances of the rape of Helen and the wrong done to Menelaus. These charges they brought not only before the priests, but also before the warden of that mouth of the river, whose name was Thonis. As soon as he received the intelligence, Thonis sent a message to Proteus, who was at Memphis, to this effect. A stranger is arrived from Greece. He is by race a Teucrian, and has done a wicked deed in the country from which he's come. Having beguiled the wife of the man whose guest he was, he carried her away with him, and much treasure also. Compelled by stress of weather, he has now put in here. Are we to let him depart as he came, or shall we seize what he has brought? Proteus replied, Seize the man, be he who he may, that has dealt thus wickedly with his friend, and bring him before me, that I may hear what he will say for himself. Thonis, on receiving these orders, arrested Alexander and stopped the departure of his ships. Then, taking with him Alexander, Helen, the treasures, and also the fugitive slaves, he went up to Memphis. When all were arrived, Proteus asked Alexander who he was and whence he had come. Alexander replied by giving his descent, the name of his country, and a true account of his late voyage. Then Proteus questioned him as to how he got possession of Helen. In his reply, Alexander became confused and diverged from the truth, whereon the slaves interposed, confuted his statements, and told the whole story of the crime. Finally, Proteus delivered judgment as follows. Did I not regard it as a matter of the utmost consequence that no stranger driven to my country by adverse winds should ever be put to death, I would certainly have avenged the Greek by slaying thee. Thou basest of men, after accepting hospitality, to do so wicked a deed. First thou didst seduce the wife of thy own host, then, not content therewith, thou must violently excite her mind and steal her away from her husband. Nay, even so thou wert not satisfied, but on leaving thou must plunder the house in which thou hadst been a guest. Now then, as I think it of the greatest importance to put no stranger to death, I suffer thee to depart. But the woman and the treasures I shall not permit to be carried away. Here they must stay till the Greek stranger comes in person and takes them back with him. For thyself and thy companions I command thee to be gone from my land within the space of 3 days, and I warn you that otherwise at the end of that time you will be treated as enemies. Such was the tale told me by the priests concerning the arrival of Helen at the court of Proteus. It seems to me that Homer was acquainted with this story, and while discarding it because he thought it less adapted for epic poetry than the version which he followed, showed that it was not unknown to him. This is evident from the travels which he assigns to Alexander in the Iliad. And let it be borne in mind that he has nowhere else contradicted himself, making him be carried out of his course on his return with Helen, and after diverse wanderings come at last to Sidon in Phoenicia. The passage is in the Bravery of Diomed, and the words are as follows. There were the robes, many-coloured, the work of Sidonian women. They from Sidon had come, what time God-shaped Alexander over the broad sea brought that way the high-born Helen. In the Odyssey also the same fact is alluded to in these words. Such so wisely prepared were the drugs that her stores afforded, excellent, gift which once Polydamna, partner of Thonis, gave her in Egypt, where many the simples that grow in the meadows, potent to cure in part as potent to injure. Menelaus too, in the same poem, thus addresses Telemachus. Much did I long to return, but the gods still kept me in Egypt, angry because I had failed to pay them their hecatombs duly. In these places Homer shows himself acquainted with the voyage of Alexander to Egypt, for Syria borders on Egypt, and the Phoenicians, to whom Sidon belongs, dwell in Syria. For there it's said that Alexander arrived at Ilium with Helen on the 3rd day after he left Sparta, the wind having been favourable and the sea smooth, whereas in the Iliad the poet makes him wander before he brings her home. Enough, however, for the present of Homer and the Cypria. I made inquiry of the priests whether the story which the Greeks tell about Ilium is a fable or no. In reply, they related the following particulars, of which they declared that Menelaus had himself informed them. After the rape of Helen, a vast army of Greeks, wishing to render help to Menelaus, set sail for the Teucrian territory. On their arrival they disembarked and formed their camp, after which they sent ambassadors to Ilium, of whom Menelaus was one. The embassy was received within the walls, and demanded the restoration of Helen with the treasures which Alexander had carried off, and likewise required satisfaction for the wrong done. The Teucrians gave at once the answer in which they persisted ever afterwards, backing their assertions sometimes even with oaths, to wit, that neither Helen nor the treasures claimed were in their possession. Both the one and the other had remained, they said, in Egypt, and it wasn't just to come upon them for what Proteus, king of Egypt, was detaining. The Greeks, imagining that the Teucrians were merely laughing at them, laid siege to the town and never rested until they finally took it. As, however, no Helen was found, and they were still told the same story, they at length believed in its truth and dispatched Menelaus to the court of Proteus. So Menelaus travelled to Egypt, and on his arrival sailed up the river as far as Memphis and related all that had happened. He met with the utmost hospitality, received Helen back unharmed, and recovered all his treasures. After this friendly treatment, Menelaus, they said, behaved most unjustly towards the Egyptians, for as it happened that at the time when he wanted to take his departure, he was detained by the wind being contrary, and as he found this obstruction continued, he had recourse to a most wicked expedient. He seized, they said, 2 children of the people of the country and offered them up in sacrifice. When this became known, the indignation of the people was stirred, and they went in pursuit of Menelaus, who, however, escaped with his ships to Libya, after which the Egyptians couldn't say whither he went. The rest they knew full well, partly by the inquiries which they had made, and partly from the circumstances having taken place in their own land, and therefore not admitting of doubt. Such is the account given by the Egyptian priests, and I am myself inclined to regard as true all that they say of Helen from the following considerations. If Helen had been at Troy, the inhabitants would, I think, have given her up to the Greeks, whether Alexander consented to it or no. For surely neither Priam nor his family could have been so infatuated as to endanger their own persons, their children, and their city, merely that Alexander might possess Helen. At any rate, if they determined to refuse at first, yet afterwards, when so many of the Trojans fell on every encounter with the Greeks, and Priam too in each battle lost a son, or sometimes 2 or 3 or even more, if we may credit the epic poets, I don't believe that even if Priam himself had been married to her, he would have declined to deliver her up, with the view of bringing the series of calamities to a close. Nor was it as if Alexander had been heir to the crown, in which case he might have had the chief management of affairs, since Priam was already old. Hector, who was his elder brother and a far braver man, stood before him and was the heir to the kingdom on the death of their father Priam, and it couldn't be Hector's interest to uphold his brother in his wrong when it brought such dire calamities upon himself and the other Trojans. But the fact was that they had no Helen to deliver, and so they told the Greeks, but the Greeks wouldn't believe what they said. Divine Providence, as I think, so willing that by their utter destruction it might be made evident to all men that when great wrongs are done, the gods will surely visit them with great punishments. Such at least is my view of the matter. When Proteus died, Rhampsinitus, the priests informed me, succeeded to the throne. His monuments were the western gateway of the temple of Hephaestus, and the 2 statues which stand in front of this gateway, called by the Egyptians the one summer, the other winter, each 25 cubits in height. The statue of summer, which is the northernmost of the 2, is worshipped by the natives, and has offerings made to it. That of winter, which stands towards the south, is treated in exactly the contrary way. King Rhampsinitus was possessed, they said, of great riches in silver, indeed to such an amount that none of the princes, his successors, surpassed or even equalled his wealth. For the better custody of this money, he proposed to build a vast chamber of hewn stone, one side of which was to form a part of the outer wall of his palace. The builder, therefore, having designs upon the treasures, contrived, as he was making the building, to insert in this wall a stone which could easily be removed from its place by 2 men, or even by 1. So the chamber was finished, and the king's money stored away in it. Time passed, and the builder fell sick, when finding his end approaching, he called for his 2 sons, and related to them the contrivance he had made in the king's treasure chamber, telling them it was for their sakes he had done it, that so they might always live in affluence. Then he gave them clear directions concerning the mode of removing the stone, and communicated the measurements, bidding them carefully keep the secret, whereby they would be controllers of the royal exchequer so long as they lived. Then the father died, and the sons were not slow in setting to work. They went by night to the palace, found the stone in the wall of the building, and having removed it with ease, plundered the treasury of a round sum. When the king next paid a visit to the apartment, he was astonished to see that the money was sunk in some of the vessels wherein it was stored away. Whom to accuse, however, he knew not, as the seals were all perfect, and the fastenings of the room secure. Still, each time that he repeated his visits, he found that more money was gone. The thieves, in truth, never stopped, but plundered the treasury ever more and more. At last the king determined to have some traps made, and set near the vessels which contained his wealth. This was done, and when the thieves came, as usual, to the treasure chamber, and one of them entering through the aperture made straight for the jars, suddenly he found himself caught in one of the traps. Perceiving that he was lost, he instantly called his brother, and telling him what had happened, entreated him to enter as quickly as possible and cut off his head, that when his body should be discovered it might not be recognized, which would have the effect of bringing ruin upon both. The other thief thought the advice good, and was persuaded to follow it. Then, fitting the stone into its place, he went home, taking with him his brother's head. When day dawned, the king came into the room, and marvelled greatly to see the body of the thief in the trap without a head, while the building was still whole, and neither entrance nor exit was to be seen anywhere. In this perplexity he commanded the body of the dead man to be hung up outside the palace wall, and set a guard to watch it, with orders that if any persons were seen weeping or lamenting near the place, they should be seized and brought before him. When the mother heard of this exposure of the corpse of her son, she took it sorely to heart, and spoke to her surviving child, bidding him devise some plan or other to get back the body, and threatening that if he did not exert himself, she would go herself to the king and denounce him as the robber. The son said all he could to persuade her to let the matter rest, but in vain. She still continued to trouble him, until at last he yielded to her importunity, and contrived as follows. Filling some skins with wine, he loaded them on donkeys, which he drove before him till he came to the place where the guards were watching the dead body. When pulling 2 or 3 of the skins towards him, he untied some of the necks which dangled by the ass's sides. The wine poured freely out, whereupon he began to beat his head and shout with all his might, seeming not to know which of the donkeys he should turn to first. When the guards saw the wine running, delighted to profit by the occasion, they rushed one and all into the road, each with some vessel or other, and caught the liquor as it was spilling. The driver pretended anger and loaded them with abuse, whereon they did their best to pacify him, until at last he appeared to soften and recover his good humour, drove his asses aside out of the road, and set to work to rearrange their burthens. Meanwhile, as he talked and chatted with the guards, one of them began to rally him and make him laugh, whereupon he gave them one of the skins as a gift. They now made up their minds to sit down and have a drinking bout where they were, so they begged him to remain and drink with them. Then the man let himself be persuaded, and stayed. As the drinking went on, they grew very friendly together, so presently he gave them another skin, upon which they drank so copiously that they were all overcome with the liquor, and growing drowsy, lay down and fell asleep on the spot. The thief waited till it was the dead of the night, and then took down the body of his brother, after which in mockery he shaved off the right side of all the soldiers' beards, and so left them. Laying his brother's body upon the asses, he carried it home to his mother, having thus accomplished the thing that she had required of him. When it came to the king's ears that the thief's body was stolen away, he was sorely vexed. Wishing, therefore, whatever it might cost, to catch the man who had contrived the trick, he had recourse, the priest said, to an expedient which I can scarcely credit. He sent his own daughter to the common stews with orders to admit all comers, but to require every man to tell her what was the cleverest and wickedest thing he had done in the whole course of his life. If anyone in reply told her the story of the thief, she was to lay hold of him and not allow him to get away. The daughter did as her father willed, whereon the thief, who was well aware of the king's motive, felt a desire to outdo him in craft and cunning. Accordingly he contrived the following plan. He procured the corpse of a man lately dead, and cutting off one of the arms at the shoulder, put it under his dress, and so went to the king's daughter. When she put the question to him, as she had done to all the rest, he replied that the wickedest thing he had ever done was cutting off the head of his brother when he was caught in a trap in the king's treasury, and the cleverest was making the guards drunk and carrying off the body. As he spoke, the princess caught at him, but the thief took advantage of the darkness to hold out to her the hand of the corpse. Imagining it to be his own hand, she seized and held it fast, while the thief, leaving it in her grasp, made his escape by the door. The king, when word was brought him of this fresh success, amazed at the sagacity and boldness of the man, sent messengers to all the towns in his dominions to proclaim a free pardon for the thief, and to promise him a rich reward if he came and made himself known. The thief took the king at his word, and came boldly into his presence, whereupon Rhampsinitus, greatly admiring him, and looking on him as the most knowing of men, gave him his daughter in marriage. The Egyptians, he said, excelled all the rest of the world in wisdom, and this man excelled all other Egyptians. The same king, I was also informed by the priests, afterwards descended alive into the region which the Greeks call Hades, and there played at dice with Demeter, sometimes winning and sometimes suffering defeat. After a while he returned to earth and brought with him a golden napkin, a gift which he had received from the goddess. From this descent of Rhampsinitus into Hades and return to earth again, the Egyptians, I was told, instituted a festival, which they certainly celebrated in my day. On what occasion it was that they instituted it, whether upon this or upon any other, I can't determine. The following are the ceremonies. On a certain day in the year, the priests weave a mantle, and binding the eyes of one of their number with a fillet, they put the mantle upon him, and take him with them into the roadway conducting to the temple of Demeter, when they depart and leave him to himself. Then the priest, thus blindfolded, is led, they say, by 2 wolves to the temple of Demeter, distant 20 furlongs from the city, where he stays a while, after which he is brought back from the temple by the wolves, and left upon the spot where they first joined him. Such as think the tales told by the Egyptians credible are free to accept them for history. For my part, I propose myself throughout my whole work faithfully to record the traditions of the several nations. The Egyptians maintain that Demeter and Dionysus preside in the realms below. They were also the first to broach the opinion that the soul of man is immortal, and that when the body dies it enters into the form of an animal which is born at the moment, thence passing on from one animal into another, until it has circled through the forms of all the creatures which tenant the earth, the water, and the air, after which it enters again into a human frame and is born anew. The whole period of the transmigration is, they say, 3,000 years. There are Greek writers, some of an earlier, some of a later date, who have borrowed this doctrine from the Egyptians and put it forward as their own. I could mention their names, but I abstain from doing so. Till the death of Rhampsinitus, the priests said Egypt was excellently governed and flourished greatly. But after him Cheops succeeded to the throne and plunged into all manner of wickedness. He closed the temples and forbade the Egyptians to offer sacrifice, compelling them instead to labor, one and all, in his service. Some were required to drag blocks of stone down to the Nile from the quarries in the Arabian range of hills. Others received the blocks after they had been conveyed in boats across the river and drew them to the range of hills called the Libyan. 100,000 men laboured constantly and were relieved every 3 months by a fresh lot. It took 10 years' oppression of the people to make the causeway for the conveyance of the stones, a work not much inferior, in my judgment, to the pyramid itself. This causeway is 5 furlongs in length, 10 fathoms wide, and in height, at the highest part, 8 fathoms. It's built of polished stone and is covered with carvings of animals. To make it took 10 years, as I said, or rather to make the causeway, the works on the mound where the pyramid stands, and the underground chambers, which Cheops intended as vaults for his own use. These last were built on a sort of island, surrounded by water introduced from the Nile by a canal. The pyramid itself was 20 years in building. It's a square 800 feet each way, and the height the same, built entirely of polished stone, fitted together with the utmost care. The stones of which it's composed are none of them less than 30 feet in length. The pyramid was built in steps, battlement-wise, as it's called, or according to others, altar-wise. After laying the stones for the base, they raised the remaining stones to their places by means of machines formed of short wooden planks. The first machine raised them from the ground to the top of the first step. On this there was another machine, which received the stone upon its arrival and conveyed it to the second step, whence a third machine advanced it still higher. Either they had as many machines as there were steps in the pyramid, or possibly they had but a single machine, which, being easily moved, was transferred from tier to tier as the stone rose. Both accounts are given, and therefore I mention both. The upper portion of the pyramid was finished first, then the middle, and finally the part which was lowest and nearest the ground. There's an inscription in Egyptian characters on the pyramid which records the quantity of radishes, onions, and garlic consumed by the labourers who constructed it, and I perfectly well remember that the interpreter who read the writing to me said that the money expended in this way was 1,600 talents of silver. If this then is a true record, what a vast sum must have been spent on the iron tools used in the work, and on the feeding and clothing of the labourers, considering the length of time the work lasted, which has already been stated, and the additional time, no small space, I imagine, which must have been occupied by the quarrying of the stones, their conveyance, and the formation of the underground apartments. The wickedness of Cheops reached to such a pitch that when he had spent all his treasures and wanted more, he sent his daughter to the stews with orders to procure him a certain sum, how much I can't say, for I wasn't told. She procured it, however, and at the same time, bent on leaving a monument which should perpetuate her own memory, she required each man to make her a present of a stone towards the works which she contemplated. With these stones she built the pyramid which stands midmost of the 3 that are in front of the Great Pyramid, measuring along each side 150 feet. Cheops reigned, the Egyptians said, 50 years, and was succeeded at his demise by Chephren, his brother. Chephren imitated the conduct of his predecessor, and like him built a pyramid, which didn't, however, equal the dimensions of his brother's. Of this I'm certain, for I measured them both myself. It has no subterraneous apartments, nor any canal from the Nile to supply it with water, as the other pyramid has. in that the Nile water, introduced through an artificial duct, surrounds an island where the body of Cheops is said to lie. Chephren built his pyramid close to the Great Pyramid of Cheops and of the same dimensions, except that he lowered the height 40 feet. For the basement he employed the many-coloured stone of Ethiopia. These two pyramids stand both on the same hill, an elevation not far short of 100 feet in height. The reign of Chephren lasted 56 years. Thus the affliction of Egypt endured for the space of 106 years, during the whole of which time the temples were shut up and never opened. The Egyptians so detest the memory of these kings that they do not much like even to mention their names. Hence they commonly call the pyramids after Philitian, a shepherd who at that time fed his flocks about the place. After Chephren, Mycerinus, they said, son of Cheops, ascended the throne. This prince disapproved the conduct of his father, reopened the temples, and allowed the people who were ground down to the lowest point of misery to return to their occupations and to resume the practice of sacrifice. His justice in the decision of causes was beyond that of all the former kings. The Egyptians praise him in this respect more highly than any of their other monarchs, declaring that he not only gave his judgments with fairness, but also, when anyone was dissatisfied with his sentence, made compensation to him out of his own purse, and thus pacified his anger. Mycerinus had established his character for mildness, and was acting as I've described, when the stroke of calamity fell on him. First of all, his daughter died, the only child that he possessed. Experiencing a bitter grief at this visitation, in his sorrow he conceived the wish to entomb his child in some unusual way. He therefore caused a cow to be made of wood, and after the interior had been hollowed out, he had the whole surface coated with gold, and in this novel tomb laid the dead body of his daughter. The cow wasn't placed underground, but continued visible to my times. It was at Sais, in the royal palace, where it occupied a chamber richly adorned. Every day there are burnt before it aromatics of every kind, and all night long a lamp is kept burning in the apartment. In an adjoining chamber are statues, which the priests at Sais declared to represent the various concubines of Mycerinus. They're colossal figures in wood, of the number of about 20, and are represented naked. Whose images they really are, I can't say. I can only repeat the account which was given to me. Concerning these colossal figures and the sacred cow, there's also another tale narrated, which runs thus. Mycerinus was enamoured of his daughter, and offered her violence. The damsel, for grief, hanged herself, and Mycerinus entombed her in the cow. Then her mother cut off the hands of all her tiring maids, because they had sided with the father, and betrayed the child, and so the statues of the maids have no hands. All this is mere fable in my judgment, especially what's said about the hands of the colossal statues. I could plainly see that the figures had only lost their hands through the effect of time. They had dropped off, and were still lying on the ground about the feet of the statues. As for the cow, the greater portion of it is hidden by a scarlet coverture. The head and neck, however, which are visible, are coated very thickly with gold, and between the horns there is a representation in gold of the orb of the sun. The figure's not erect, but lying down, with the limbs under the body, the dimensions being fully those of a large animal of the kind. Every year it's taken from the apartment where it's kept and exposed to the light of day. This is done at the season when the Egyptians beat themselves in honour of one of their gods, whose name I am unwilling to mention in connection with such a matter. They say that the daughter of Mycerinus requested her father in her dying moments to allow her once a year to see the sun. After the death of his daughter, Mycerinus was visited with a second calamity, of which I shall now proceed to give an account. An oracle reached him from the town of book2, which said, 6 years only shalt thou live upon the earth, and in the 7th thou shalt end thy days. Mycerinus, indignant, sent an angry message to the oracle, reproaching the god with his injustice. "My father and uncle," he said, "though they shut up the temples, took no thought of the gods, and destroyed multitudes of men, nevertheless enjoyed a long life. I, who am pious, am to die so soon." There came in reply a second message from the oracle. "For this very reason is thy life brought so quickly to a close. Thou hast not done as it behoved thee. Egypt was fated to suffer affliction 150 years. The 2 kings who preceded thee upon the throne understood this. Thou hast not understood it." Mycerinus, when this answer reached him, perceiving that his doom was fixed, had lamps prepared, which he lighted every day at eventime, and feasted and enjoyed himself unceasingly, both day and night, moving about in the marsh country and the woods, and visiting all the places that he heard were agreeable sojourns. His wish was to prove the oracle false, by turning the nights into days, and so living 12 years in the space of 6. He too left a pyramid, but much inferior in size to his father's. It was a square, each side of which falls short of 3 plethra by 20 feet, and is built for half its height of the stone of Ethiopia. Some of the Greeks call it the work of Herodotus, the courtesan, but they report falsely. It seems to me that these persons can't have any real knowledge who Herodotus was, otherwise they would scarcely have ascribed to her a work on which uncounted treasures, so to speak, must have been expended. Herodotus also lived during the reign of Amasis, not of Mycerinus, and was thus very many years later than the time of the kings who built the pyramids. She was a Thracian by birth, and was the slave of Iadmon, son of Hephaestopolis, a Samian. Aesop, the fable writer, was one of her fellow slaves. That Aesop belonged to Iadmon is proved by many facts, among others by this. When the Delphians, in obedience to the command of the oracle, made proclamation that if anyone claimed compensation for the murder of Aesop, he should receive it, the person who at last came forward was Iadmon, grandson of the former Iadmon, and he received the compensation. Aesop, therefore, must certainly have been the former Iadmon's slave. Herodotus really arrived in Egypt under the conduct of Xanthias the Samian. She was brought there to exercise her trade, but was redeemed for a vast sum by Charaxus, a Mytilenean, the son of Scamandronymus, the brother of Sappho the poetess. After thus obtaining her freedom, she remained in Egypt, and, as she was very beautiful, amassed great wealth for a person in her condition. Not, however, enough to enable her to erect such a work as this pyramid. Anyone who likes may go and see to what the 10th part of her wealth amounted, and he will thereby learn that her riches must not be imagined to have been very wonderfully great. Wishing to leave a memorial of herself in Greece, she determined to have something made the like of which was not to be found in any temple, and to offer it at the shrine of Delphi. So she set apart 1/10 of her possessions, and purchased with the money a quantity of iron spits, such as are fit for roasting oxen whole, whereof she made a present to the oracle. They are still to be seen there, lying of a heap, behind the altar which the Chians dedicated, opposite the sanctuary. Naucratis seems somehow to be the place where such women are most attractive. First there was this Rhodopis, of whom we've been speaking, so celebrated a person that her name came to be familiar to all the Greeks, and afterwards there was another, called Archidike, renowned throughout Greece, though not so much talked of as her predecessor. Charaxus, after ransoming Rhodopis, returned to Mytilene, and was often lashed by Sappho in her poetry. But enough has been said on the subject of this courtesan. After Mycerinus, the priest said, Asychis ascended the throne. He built the eastern gateway of the temple of Hephaestus, which in size and beauty far surpasses the other 3. All the 4 gateways have figures graven on them, and a vast amount of architectural ornament, but the gateway of Asychis is by far the most richly adorned. In the reign of this king, money being scarce and commercial dealings straitened, a law was passed that the borrower might pledge his father's body to raise the sum whereof he had need. A proviso was appended to this law, giving the lender authority over the entire sepulchre of the borrower, so that a man who took up money under this pledge, if he died without paying the debt, couldn't obtain burial either in his own ancestral tomb or in any other, nor could he during his lifetime bury in his own tomb any member of his family. The same king, desirous of eclipsing all his predecessors upon the throne, left as a monument of his reign a pyramid of brick. It bears an inscription cut in stone which runs thus: "Despise me not in comparison with the stone pyramids, for I surpass them all, as much as Jove surpasses the other gods." A pole was plunged into a lake, and the mud which clave thereto was gathered, and bricks were made of the mud, and so I was formed. Such were the chief actions of this prince. He was succeeded on the throne, they say, by a blind man, a native of Anisis, whose own name also was Anisis. Under him Egypt was invaded by a vast army of Ethiopians, led by Sabakos, their king. The blind Anisis fled away to the marsh country, and the Ethiopian was lord of the land for 50 years, during which his mode of rule was the following. When an Egyptian was guilty of an offence, his plan was not to punish him with death. Instead of so doing, he sentenced him, according to the nature of his crime, to raise the ground to a greater or a less extent in the neighbourhood of the city to which he belonged. Thus the cities came to be even more elevated than they were before. As early as the time of Sesostris, they had been raised by those who dug the canals in his reign. This second elevation of the soil under the Ethiopian king gave them a very lofty position. Among the many cities which thus attained to a great elevation, none, I think, was raised so much as the town called Bubastis, where there's a temple of the goddess Bubastis, which well deserves to be described. Other temples may be grander and may have cost more in the building, but there's none so pleasant to the eye as this of Bubastis. The Bubastis of the Egyptians is the same as the Artemis or Diana of the Greeks. The following is a description of this edifice. Excepting the entrance, the whole forms an island. 2 artificial channels from the Nile, one on either side of the temple, encompass the building, leaving only a narrow passage by which it's approached. These channels are each 100 feet wide, and are thickly shaded with trees. The gateway is 60 feet in height, and is ornamented with figures cut upon the stone, 6 cubits high, and well worthy of notice. The temple stands in the middle of the city, and is visible on all sides as one walks round it. For as the city has been raised up by embankment, while the temple has been left untouched in its original condition, you look down upon it wheresoever you are. A low wall runs round the enclosure, having figures engraved upon it, and inside there's a grove of beautiful tall trees growing round the shrine, which contains the image of the goddess. The enclosure is a furlong in length, and the same in breadth. The entrance to it is by a road paved with stone for a distance of about 3 furlongs, which passes straight through the marketplace with an easterly direction, and is about 400 feet in width. Trees of an extraordinary height grow on each side of the road, which conducts from the temple of Bubastis to that of Hermes. The Ethiopian finally quitted Egypt, the priest said, by a hasty flight under the following circumstances. He saw in his sleep a vision. A man stood by his side and counselled him to gather together all the priests of Egypt and cut every one of them asunder. On this, according to the account which he himself gave, it came into his mind that the gods intended hereby to lead him to commit an act of sacrilege, which would be sure to draw down upon him some punishment, either at the hands of gods or men. So he resolved not to do the deed suggested to him, but rather to retire from Egypt, as the time during which it was fated that he should hold the country had now, he thought, expired. For before he left Ethiopia, he had been told by the oracles, which are venerated there, that he was to reign 50 years over Egypt. The years were now fled, and the dream had come to trouble him. He therefore, of his own accord, withdrew from the land. As soon as Sabacos was gone, the blind king left the marshes and resumed the government. He'd lived in the marsh region the whole time, having formed for himself an island there by a mixture of earth and ashes. While he remained, the natives had orders to bring him food unbeknown to the Ethiopian, and latterly, at his request, each man had brought him with the food a certain quantity of ashes. Before Amycraeus, no one was able to discover the site of this island, which continued unknown to the kings of Egypt who preceded him on the throne for the space of 700 years or more. The name which it bears is Elbow. It's about 10 furlongs across in each direction. The next king, I was told, was a priest of Hephaestus, called Sethos. This monarch despised and neglected the warrior class of the Egyptians as though he didn't need their services. Among other indignities which he offered them, he took from them the lands which they had possessed under all the previous kings, consisting of 12 acres of choice land for each warrior. Afterwards, therefore, when Sennacherib, king of the Arabians and Assyrians, marched his vast army into Egypt, the warriors, one and all, refused to come to his aid. On this, the monarch, greatly distressed, entered into the inner sanctuary, and before the image of the god bewailed the fate which impended over him. As he wept, he fell asleep, and dreamt that the god came and stood at his side, bidding him be of good cheer, and go boldly forth to meet the Arabian host, which would do him no hurt, as he himself would send those who should help him. Sethos then, relying on the dream, collected such of the Egyptians as were willing to follow him, who were none of them warriors, but traders, artisans, and market people, and with these marched to Pelusium, which commands the entrance into Egypt, and there pitched his camp. As the two armies lay here opposite one another, there came in the night a multitude of field mice, which devoured all the quivers and bowstrings of the enemy, and ate the thongs by which they managed their shields. Next morning they commenced their flight, and great multitudes fell, as they had no arms with which to defend themselves. There stands to this day in the temple of Hephaestus a stone statue of Sethos with a mouse in his hand, and an inscription to this effect: "Look on me and learn to reverence the gods." Thus far I've spoken on the authority of the Egyptians and their priests. They declare that from their first king to this last-mentioned monarch, the priest of Hephaestus, was a period of 341 generations. Such, at least, they say, was the number both of their kings and of their high priests during this interval. Now, 300 generations of men make 10,000 years, 3 generations filling up the century, and the remaining 41 generations make 1,340 years. Thus the whole number of years is 11,340, in which entire space, they said, no god had ever appeared in a human form. Nothing of this kind had happened either under the former or under the later Egyptian kings. The sun, however, had within this period of time on 4 several occasions moved from his wonted course, twice rising where he now sets, and twice setting where he now rises. Egypt was in no degree affected by these changes. The productions of the land and of the river remained the same, nor was there anything unusual either in the diseases or the deaths. When Herodotus, the historian, was at Thebes, and discoursing of his genealogy, traced his descent to a god in the person of his 16th ancestor, the priests of Zeus did to him exactly as they afterwards did to me, though I made no boast of my family. They led me into the inner sanctuary, which is a spacious chamber, and showed me a multitude of colossal statues in wood, which they counted up, and found to amount to the exact number they had said, the custom being for every high priest during his lifetime to set up his statue in the temple. As they showed me the figures and reckoned them up, they assured me that each was the son of the one preceding him, and this they repeated throughout the whole line, beginning with the representation of the priest last deceased, and continuing till they had completed the series. When Herodotus, in giving his genealogy, mentioned a god as his 16th ancestor, the priests opposed their genealogy to his, going through this list and refusing to allow that any man was ever born of a god. Their colossal figures were each, they said, a pyromis, born of a pyromis, and the number of them was 345. Through the whole series, pyromis followed pyromis, and the line did not run up either to a god or a hero. The word pyromis may be rendered gentleman. Of such a nature were, they said, the beings represented by these images. They were very far indeed from being gods. However, in the times anterior to them it was otherwise. Then Egypt had gods for its rulers who dwelt upon the earth with men, one being always supreme above the rest. The last of these was Horus, the son of Osiris, called by the Greeks Apollo. He deposed Typhon and ruled over Egypt as its last god-king. Osiris is named Dionysus by the Greeks. The Greeks regard Heracles, Dionysus, and Pan as the youngest of the gods. With the Egyptians, contrariwise, Pan is exceedingly ancient, and belongs to those whom they call the 8 gods who existed before the rest. Heracles is one of the gods of the second order, who are known as the 12, and Dionysus belongs to the gods of the third order, whom the 12 produced. I've already mentioned how many years intervened, according to the Egyptians, between the birth of Heracles and the reign of Amasis. From Pan to this period they count a still longer time, and even from Dionysus, who's the youngest of the 3, they reckon 15,000 years to the reign of that king. In these matters they say they can't be mistaken, as they've always kept count of the years and noted them in their registers. But from the present day to the time of Dionysus, the reputed son of Semele, daughter of Cadmus, is a period of not more than 1,600 years. To that of Heracles, son of Alcmena, is about 900, while to the time of Pan, son of Penelope, Pan, according to the Greeks, was her child by Hermes, is a shorter space than to the Trojan War, 800 years, or thereabouts. It's open to all to receive whichever he may prefer of these 2 traditions. My own opinion about them has been already declared. If indeed these gods had been publicly known and had grown old in Greece, as was the case with Heracles, son of Amphitryon, Dionysus, son of Semele, and Pan, son of Penelope, it might have been said that the last-mentioned personages were men who bore the names of certain previously existing deities. But Dionysus, according to the Greek tradition, was no sooner born than he was sewn up in Zeus's thigh and carried off to Nysa, above Egypt, in Ethiopia, and as to Pan, they don't even profess to know what happened to him after his birth. To me, therefore, it's quite manifest that the names of these gods became known to the Greeks after those of their other deities, and that they count their birth from the time when they first acquired a knowledge of them. Thus far my narrative rests on the accounts given by the Egyptians. In what follows, I have the authority not of the Egyptians only, but of others also who agree with them. I shall speak likewise in part from my own observation. When the Egyptians regained their liberty after the reign of the priest of Hephaestus, unable to continue any while without a king, they divided Egypt into 12 districts and set 12 kings over them. These 12 kings, united together by intermarriages, ruled Egypt in peace, having entered into engagements with one another not to depose any of their number, nor to aim at any aggrandizement of one above the rest, but to dwell together in perfect amity. Now, the reason why they made these stipulations and guarded with care against their infraction was because at the very first establishment of the 12 kingdoms an oracle had declared that he among them who should pour in Hephaestus's temple a libation from a cup of bronze would become monarch of the whole land of Egypt. Now the 12 held their meetings at all the temples. To bind themselves yet more closely together, it seemed good to them to leave a common monument. In pursuance of this resolution, they made the labyrinth, which lies a little above Lake Moeris, in the neighbourhood of the place called the City of Crocodiles. I visited this place, and found it to surpass description. For if all the walls and other great works of the Greeks could be put together in one, they wouldn't equal either for labour or expense this labyrinth. And yet the Temple of Ephesus is a building worthy of note, and so is the Temple of Samos. The pyramids likewise surpass description, and are severally equal to a number of the greatest works of the Greeks, but the labyrinth surpasses the pyramids. It has 12 courts, all of them roofed, with gates exactly opposite one another, 6 looking to the north and 6 to the south. A single wall surrounds the entire building. There are 2 different sorts of chambers throughout, half underground, half above ground, the latter built upon the former. The whole number of these chambers is 3,100 of each kind. The upper chambers I myself passed through and saw, and what I say concerning them is from my own observation. Of the underground chambers I can only speak from report, for the keepers of the building couldn't be got to show them, since they contained, as they said, the sepulchres of the kings who built the labyrinth, and also those of the sacred crocodiles. Thus it's easy from hearsay only that I can speak of the lower chambers. The upper chambers, however, I saw with my own eyes, and found them to excel all other human productions. For the passages through the houses, and the varied windings of the paths across the courts, excited in me infinite admiration, as I passed from the courts into chambers, and from the chambers into colonnades, and from the colonnades into fresh houses, and again from these into courts unseen before. The roof was throughout of stone, like the walls, and the walls were carved all over with figures. Every court was surrounded with a colonnade, which was built of white stones, exquisitely fitted together. At the corner of the labyrinth stands a pyramid 40 fathoms high, with large figures engraved on it, which is entered by a subterranean passage. Wonderful as is the labyrinth, the work called the Lake of Moeris, which is close by the labyrinth, is yet more astonishing. The measure of its circumference is 60 skeins, or 3,600 furlongs, which is equal to the entire length of Egypt along the seacoast. The lake stretches in its longest direction from north to south, and in its deepest parts is of the depth of 50 fathoms. It's manifestly an artificial excavation, for nearly in the centre there stand 2 pyramids rising to the height of 50 fathoms above the surface of the water and extending as far beneath, crowned each of them with a colossal statue sitting upon a throne. Thus these pyramids are 100 fathoms high, which is exactly a furlong stadium of 600 feet. The fathom being 6 feet in length, or 4 cubits, which is the same thing, since a cubit measures 6 and a foot 4 palms. The water of the lake doesn't come out of the ground, which is here excessively dry, but is introduced by a canal from the Nile. The current sets for 6 months into the lake from the river, and for the next 6 months into the river from the lake. While it runs outward, it returns a talent of silver daily to the royal treasury from the fish that are taken, and when the current is the other way, the return sinks to 1/3 of that sum. The natives told me that there was a subterranean passage from this lake to the Libyan Syrtis, running westward into the interior by the hills above Memphis. As I couldn't anywhere see the earth which had been taken out when the excavation was made, and I was curious to know what had become of it, I asked the Egyptians who lived closest to the lake where the earth had been put. The answer that they gave me I readily accepted as true, since I had heard of the same thing being done at Nineveh of the Assyrians. There, once upon a time, certain thieves, having formed a plan to get into their possession the vast treasures of Sardanapalus, the Ninevite king, which were laid up in subterranean treasuries, proceeded to tunnel a passage from the house where they lived into the royal palace, calculating the distance and the direction. At nightfall they took the earth from the excavation and carried it to the river Tigris, which ran by Nineveh, continuing to get rid of it in this manner until they had accomplished their purpose. It was exactly in the same way that the Egyptians disposed of the mould from their excavation, except that they did it by day and not by night, for as fast as the earth was dug they carried it to the Nile, which they knew would disperse it far and wide. Such was the account which I received of the formation of this lake. The 12 kings for some time dealt honourably by one another, but at length it happened that on a certain occasion, when they had met to worship in the temple of Hephaestus, the high priest, on the last day of the festival, in bringing forth the golden goblets from which they were wont to pour the libations, mistook the number, and brought 11 goblets only for the 12 princes. Psammetichus was standing last, and being left without a cup, he took his helmet, which was of bronze, from off his head, stretched it out to receive the liquor, and so made his libation. All the kings were accustomed to wear helmets, and all indeed wore them at this very time, nor was there any crafty design in the action of Psammetichus. The 11, however, when they came to consider what had been done, and bethought them of the oracle which had declared that he who of the 12 should pour a libation from a cup of bronze, the same would be king of the whole land of Egypt, doubted at first if they shouldn't put Psammetichus to death. Finding, however, upon examination that he had acted in the matter without any guilty intent, they didn't think it would be just to kill him, but determined instead to strip him of the chief part of his power and to banish him to the marshes, forbidding him to leave them or to hold any communication with the rest of Egypt. This was the second time that Psammetichus had been driven into banishment. On a former occasion he had fled from Sabachos the Ethiopian, who had put his father Necos to death, and had taken refuge in Syria, from whence, after the retirement of the Ethiop in consequence of his dream, he was brought back by the Egyptians of the Saitic canton. Now it was his ill fortune to be banished a second time by the 11 kings on account of the libation which he had poured from his helmet. On this occasion he fled to the marshes. Feeling that he was an injured man, and designing to avenge himself upon his persecutors, Psammetichus sent to the city of book2, where there is an oracle of Leto, the most veracious of all the oracles of the Egyptians, and having inquired concerning means of vengeance, received for answer that vengeance would come from the sea, when brazen men should appear. Great was his incredulity when this answer arrived, for never he thought would brazen men arrive to be his helpers. However, not long afterwards, certain Carians and Ionians, who had left their country on a voyage of plunder, were carried by stress of weather to Egypt, where they disembarked, all equipped in their brazen armour, and was seen by the natives, one of whom carried the tidings to Psammetichus, and as he had never before seen men clad in brass, he reported that brazen men had come from the sea and were plundering the plain. Psammetichus, perceiving at once that the oracle was accomplished, made friendly advances to the strangers, and engaged them by splendid promises to enter into his service. He then, with their aid and that of the Egyptians who espoused his cause, attacked the 11 and vanquished them. When Psammetichus had thus become sole monarch of Egypt, he built the southern gateway of the temple of Hephaestus in Memphis, and also a court for Apis, in which Apis is kept whenever he makes his appearance in Egypt. This court is opposite the gateway of Psammetichus, and is surrounded with a colonnade and adorned with a multitude of figures. Instead of pillars, the colonnade rests upon colossal statues, 12 cubits in height. The Greek name for Apis is Epaphus. To the Ionians and Carians, who had lent him their assistance, Psammetichus assigned as abodes 2 places opposite to each other, one on either side of the Nile, which received the name of the Camps. He also made good all the splendid promises by which he had gained their support. And further, he entrusted to their care certain Egyptian children, whom they were to teach the language of the Greeks. These children, thus instructed, became the parents of the entire class of interpreters in Egypt. The Ionians and Carians occupied for many years the places assigned them by Psammetichus, which lay near the sea, a little below the city of Bubastis, on the Pelusiac mouth of the Nile. King Amasis long afterwards removed the Greeks hence and settled them at Memphis to guard him against the native Egyptians. From the date of the original settlement of these persons in Egypt, we Greeks, through our intercourse with them, have acquired an accurate knowledge of the several events in Egyptian history, from the reign of Psammetichus downwards. But before his time, no foreigners had ever taken up their residence in that land. The docks where their vessels were laid up and the ruins of their habitations were still to be seen in my day, at the place where they dwelt originally, before they were removed by Amasis. Such was the mode by which Psammetichus became master of Egypt. I've already made mention more than once of the Egyptian oracle, and as it well deserves notice, I'll now proceed to give an account of it more at length. It's a temple of Leto, situated in the midst of a great city on the Sebennytic mouth of the Nile, at some distance up the river from the sea. The name of the city, as I've before observed, is Buto. And in it are two other temples also, one of Apollo and one of Artemis. Leto's temple, which contains the oracle, is a spacious building with a gateway 10 fathoms in height. The most wonderful thing that was actually to be seen about this temple was a chapel in the enclosure, made of a single stone, the length and height of which were the same, each wall being 40 cubits square, and the whole a single block. Another block of stone formed the roof, and projected at the eaves to the extent of 4 cubits. This, as I've said, is what astonished me the most of all the things that were actually to be seen about the temple. The next greatest marvel was the island called Chemis. This island lies in the middle of a broad and deep lake, close by the temple, and the natives declare that it floats. For my own part, I didn't see it float or even move, and I wondered greatly when they told me concerning it whether there be really such a thing as a floating island. It has a grand temple of Apollo built upon it, in which are 3 distinct altars. Palm trees grow on it in great abundance, and many other trees, some of which bear fruit, while others are barren. The Egyptians tell the following story in connection with this island to explain the way in which it first came to float. In former times, when the isle was still fixed and motionless, Leto, one of the 8 gods of the first order who dwelt in the city of Buto, where now she has her oracle, received Apollo as a sacred charge from Isis and saved him by hiding him in what is now called the floating island. Typhon, meanwhile, was searching everywhere in hopes of finding the child of Osiris. According to the Egyptians, Apollo and Artemis are the children of Dionysus and Isis, while Leto is their nurse and their preserver. They call Apollo, in their language, Horus. Demeter they call Isis, Artemis Bubastis. From this Egyptian tradition, and from no other, it must have been that Aeschylus, the son of Euphorion, took the idea, which is found in none of the earlier poets, of making Artemis the daughter of Demeter. The island, therefore, in consequence of this event, was first made to float. Such at least is the account which the Egyptians give. Psammetichus ruled Egypt for 54 years, during 29 of which he pressed the siege of Azotus without intermission till finally he took the place. Azotus is a great town in Syria. Of all the cities that we know, none ever stood so long a siege. Psammetichus left a son called Necos, who succeeded him upon the throne. This prince was the first to attempt the construction of the canal to the Red Sea, a work completed afterwards by Darius the Persian, the length of which is 4 days' journey, and the width such as to admit of 2 triremes being rowed along it abreast. The water is derived from the Nile, which the canal leaves a little above the city of Bubastis, near Patumus, the Arabian town, being continued thence until it joins the Red Sea. At first it's carried along the Arabian side of the Egyptian plain as far as the chain of hills opposite Memphis, whereby the plain is bounded and in which lie the great stone quarries. Here it skirts the base of the hills running in a direction from west to east, after which it turns and enters a narrow pass, trending southwards from this point until it enters the Arabian Gulf. From the northern sea to that which is called the southern or Erythraean, the shortest and quickest passage, which is from Mount Cassius, the boundary between Egypt and Syria, to the Gulf of Arabia, is a distance of exactly 1,000 furlongs. But the way by the canal is very much longer on account of the crookedness of its course. 120,000 of the Egyptians employed upon the work in the reign of Nikos lost their lives in making the excavation. He at length desisted from his undertaking in consequence of an oracle which warned him that he was labouring for the barbarian. The Egyptians call by the name of barbarians all such as speak a language different from their own. Nikos, when he gave up the construction of the canal, turned all his thoughts to war, and set to work to build a fleet of triremes, some intended for service in the northern sea, and some for the navigation of the Erythraean. These last were built in the Arabian Gulf, where the dry docks in which they lay are still visible. These fleets he employed wherever he had occasion, while he also made war by land upon the Syrians, and defeated them in a pitched battle at Magdalos, after which he made himself master of Caditis, a large city of Syria. The dress which he wore on these occasions he sent to Branchidae in Milesia as an offering to Apollo. After having reigned in all 16 years, Nikos died, and at his death bequeathed the throne to his son Samis. In the reign of Samis, ambassadors from Elis arrived in Egypt, boasting that their arrangements for the conduct of the Olympic Games were the best and fairest that could be devised, and fancying that not even the Egyptians, who surpassed all other nations in wisdom, could add anything to their perfection. When these persons reached Egypt and explained the reason of their visit, the king summoned an assembly of all the wisest of the Egyptians. They met, and the Eleans, having given them a full account of all their rules and regulations with respect to the contests, said that they had come to Egypt for the express purpose of learning whether the Egyptians could improve the fairness of their regulations in any particular. The Egyptians considered a while and then made inquiry if they allowed their own citizens to enter the lists. The Eleans answered that the lists were open to all Greeks, whether they belonged to Elis or to any other state. Hereupon the Egyptians observed that if this were so, they departed from justice very widely, since it was impossible but that they would favour their own countrymen, and deal unfairly by foreigners. If therefore they really wished to manage the games with fairness, and if this was the object of their coming to Egypt, they advised them to confine the contests to strangers, and allow no native of Elis to be a candidate. Such was the advice which the Egyptians gave to the Eleans. Samis reigned only 6 years. He attacked Ethiopia, and died almost directly afterwards. Apries, his son, succeeded him upon the throne, who, excepting Psammetichus, his great-grandfather, was the most prosperous of all the kings that ever ruled over Egypt. The length of his reign was 25 years, and in the course of it he marched an army to attack Sidon, and fought a battle with the king of Tyre by sea. When at length the time came that was fated to bring him woe, an occasion arose which I shall describe more fully in my Libyan history, only touching it very briefly here. An army, dispatched by Apries to attack Cyrene, having met with a terrible reverse, the Egyptians laid the blame on him, imagining that he had, of malice prepense, sent the troops into the jaws of destruction. They believed he had wished a vast number of them to be slain, in order that he himself might reign with more security over the rest of the Egyptians. Indignant, therefore, at this usage, the soldiers who returned, and the friends of the slain, broke instantly into revolt. Apries, on learning these circumstances, sent Amasis to the rebels to appease the tumult by persuasion. Upon his arrival, as he was seeking to restrain the malcontents by his exhortations, one of them, coming behind him, put a helmet on his head, saying as he put it on that he thereby crowned him king. Amasis was not altogether displeased at the action, as his conduct soon made manifest, for no sooner had the insurgents agreed to make him actually their king than he prepared to march with them against Apries. That monarch, on tidings of these events reaching him, sent Patarbemis, one of his courtiers, a man of high rank, to Amasis with orders to bring him alive into his presence. Patarbemis, on arriving at the place where Amasis was, called on him to come back with him to the king, whereupon Amasis broke a coarse jest, and said, "Prithee take that back to thy master." When the envoy, notwithstanding this reply, persisted in his request, exhorting Amasis to obey the summons of the king, he made answer that this was exactly what he had long been intending to do. Apries would have no reason to complain of him on the score of delay. He would shortly come himself to the king and bring others with him. Patarbemis, upon this, comprehending the intention of Amasis, partly from his replies and partly from the preparations which he saw in progress, departed hastily, wishing to inform the king with all speed of what was going on. Apries, however, when he saw him approaching without Amasis, fell into a paroxysm of rage, and not giving himself time for reflection, commanded the nose and ears of Patarbemis to be cut off. Then the rest of the Egyptians, who had hitherto espoused the cause of Apries, when they saw a man of such note among them so shamefully outraged, without a moment's hesitation went over to the rebels, and put themselves at the disposal of Amasis. Apries, informed of this new calamity, armed his mercenaries, and led them against the Egyptians. This was a body of Carians and Ionians, numbering 30,000 men, which was now with him at Sais, where his palace stood, a vast building, well worthy of notice. The army of Apries marched out to attack the host of the Egyptians, while that of Amasis went forth to fight the strangers. And now both armies drew near the city of Momenphis, and prepared for the coming fight. The Egyptians are divided into 7 distinct classes. These are the priests, the warriors, the cowherds, the swineherds, the tradesmen, the interpreters, and the boatmen. Their titles indicate their occupations. The warriors consist of Hemotobians and Calasyrians, who come from different cantons, the whole of Egypt being parcelled out into districts bearing this name. The following cantons furnish the Hemotobians: the cantons of Busiris, Sais, Chemis, Paprimis, that of the island called Prosopitis, and half of Natho. They number, when most numerous, 160,000. None of them ever practices a trade, but all are given wholly to war. The cantons of the Calasyrians are different. They include the following: the cantons of Thebes, Bubastis, Aphthis, Tanis, Mendes, Sebennytus, Athribis, Pharbaethus, Thermuis, Onuphis, Anisis, and Myekphoris. This last canton consists of an island which lies over against the town of Bubastis. The Calasyrians, when at their greatest number, have amounted to 250,000. Like the Hemotobians, they are forbidden to pursue any trade and devote themselves entirely to warlike exercises, the son following the father's calling. Whether the Greeks borrowed from the Egyptians their notions about trade, like so many others, I can't say for certain. I have remarked that the Thracians, the Scyths, the Persians, the Lydians, and almost all other barbarians hold the citizens who practice trades and their children in less repute than the rest, while they esteem as noble those who keep aloof from handicrafts, and especially honour such as are given wholly to war. These ideas prevail throughout the whole of Greece, particularly among the Lacedaemonians. Corinth is the place where mechanics are least despised. The warrior class in Egypt had certain special privileges in which none of the rest of the Egyptians participated, except the priests. In the first place, each man had 12 aururae of land, assigned him free from tax. The aurura is a square of 100 Egyptian cubits, the Egyptian cubit being of the same length as the Samian. All the warriors enjoyed this privilege together, but there were other advantages which came to each in rotation, the same man never obtaining them twice. 1,000 Calasirians and the same number of Hemotibians formed in alternate years the bodyguard of the king, and during their year of service these persons, besides their aururae, received a daily portion of meat and drink consisting of 5 pounds of baked bread, 2 pounds of beef, and 4 cups of wine. When Apries, at the head of his mercenaries, and Amasis, in command of the whole native force of the Egyptians, encountered one another near the city of Memphis, an engagement presently took place. The foreign troops fought bravely, but were overpowered by numbers, in which they fell very far short of their adversaries. It's said that Apries believed that there wasn't a god who could cast him down from his eminence, so firmly did he think that he had established himself in his kingdom. But at this time the battle went against him, and his army being worsted, he fell into the enemy's hands, and was brought back a prisoner to Sais, where he was lodged in what had been his own house, but was now the palace of Amasis. Amasis treated him with kindness, and kept him in the palace for a while, but finding his conduct blamed by the Egyptians, who charged him with acting unjustly in preserving a man who had shown himself so bitter an enemy both to them and him, he gave Apries over into the hands of his former subjects to deal with as they chose. Then the Egyptians took him and strangled him, but having so done, they buried him in the sepulchre of his fathers. This tomb is in the temple of Athena, very near the sanctuary, on the left hand as one enters. The Saites buried all the kings who belonged to their canton inside this temple, and thus it even contains the tomb of Amasis as well as that of Apries and his family. The latter isn't so close to the sanctuary as the former, but still it is within the temple. It stands in the court, and is a spacious cloister built of stone and adorned with pillars carved so as to resemble palm trees, and with other sumptuous ornaments. Within the cloister is a chamber with folding doors, behind which lies the sepulchre of the king. Here, too, in this same precinct of Athena at Sais, is the burial place of one whom I think it not right to mention in such a connection. It stands behind the temple against the back wall, which it entirely covers. There are also some large stone obelisks in the enclosure, and there is a lake near them, adorned with an edging of stone. In form it's circular, and in size, as it seemed to me, about equal to the lake in Delos, called the Hoop. On this lake it is that the Egyptians represent by night his sufferings, whose name I refrain from mentioning, and this representation they call their mysteries. I know well the whole course of the proceedings in these ceremonies, but they shall not pass my lips. So too with regard to the mysteries of Demeter, which the Greeks term the Thesmophoria. I know them, but I shall not mention them, except so far as may be done without impiety. The daughters of Danaus brought these rites from Egypt and taught them to the Pelasgic women of the Peloponnese. Afterwards, when the inhabitants of the peninsula were driven from their homes by the Dorians, the rites perished. Only in Arcadia, where the natives remained and were not compelled to migrate, their observance continued. After Apries had been put to death in the way that I've described above, Amasis reigned over Egypt. He belonged to the canton of Sais, being a native of the town called Siouf. At first his subjects looked down on him and held him in small esteem, because he had been a mere private person, and of a house of no great distinction. But after a time Amasis succeeded in reconciling them to his rule, not by severity, but by cleverness. Among his other splendour he had a golden foot-pan, in which his guests and himself were wont upon occasion to wash their feet. This vessel he caused to be broken in pieces, and made of the gold an image of one of the gods, which he set up in the most public place in the whole city, upon which the Egyptians flocked to the image and worshipped it with the utmost reverence. Amasis, finding this was so, called an assembly, and opened the matter to them, explaining how the image had been made of the footpan, wherein they had been wont formerly to wash their feet, and to put all manner of filth, yet now it was greatly reverenced. And truly, he went on to say, it had gone with him as with the footpan. If he was a private person formerly, yet now he had come to be their king. And so he bade them honour and reverence him. Such was the mode in which he won over the Egyptians, and brought them to be content to do him service. The following was the general habit of his life. From early dawn to the time when the forum was wont to fill, he sedulously transacted all the business that was brought before him. During the remainder of the day he drank and joked with his guests, passing the time in witty and sometimes scarce seemly conversation. It grieved his friends that he should thus demean himself, and accordingly some of them chid him on the subject, saying to him, O king, thou dost but ill guard thy royal dignity, whilst thou allowest thyself in such levities. Thou shouldst sit in state upon a stately throne, and busy thyself with affairs the whole day long. So would the Egyptians feel that a great man rules them, and thou wouldst be better spoken of. But now thou conductest thyself in no kingly fashion. Amasis answered them thus, Bowmen bend their bows when they wish to shoot, embrace them when the shooting is over. Were they kept always strung, they would break, and fail the archer in time of need. So it is with men. If they give themselves constantly to serious work, and never indulge a while in pastime or sport, they lose their senses, and become mad or moody. Knowing this, I divide my life between pastime and business. Thus he answered his friends. It said that Amasis, even while he was a private man, had the same tastes for drinking and jesting, and was averse to engaging in any serious employment. He lived in constant feasts and revelries, and whenever his means failed him, he roamed about and robbed people. On such occasions the persons from whom he had stolen would bring him, if he denied the charge, before the nearest oracle. Sometimes the oracle would pronounce him guilty of the theft, at other times it would acquit him. When afterwards he came to be king, he neglected the temples of such gods as had declared that he was not a thief, and neither contributed to their adornment, nor frequented them for sacrifice, since he regarded them as utterly worthless, and their oracles as wholly false. But the gods who had detected his guilt he considered to be true gods, whose oracles did not deceive, and these he honoured exceedingly. First of all, therefore, he built the gateway of the temple of Athena at Sais, which is an astonishing work, far surpassing all other buildings of the same kind, both in extent and height, and built with stones of rare size and excellency. In the next place he presented to the temple a number of large colossal statues, and several prodigious androsphinxes, besides certain stones for the repairs of a most extraordinary size. Some of these he got from the quarries over against Memphis, but the largest were brought from Elephantine, which is 20 days' voyage from Sais. Of all these wonderful masses, that which I most admire is a chamber made of a single stone, which was quarried at Elephantine. It took 3 years to convey this block from the quarry to Sais, and in the conveyance were employed no fewer than 2,000 labourers, who were all from the class of boatmen. The length of this chamber on the outside is 21 cubits, its breadth 14 cubits, and its height 8. The measurements inside are the following. The length 18 cubits and 5/6, the breadth 12 cubits, and the height 5. It lies near the entrance of the temple, where it was left in consequence of the following circumstance. It happened that the architect, just as the stone had reached the spot where it now stands, heaved a sigh, considering the length of time that the removal had taken, and feeling wearied with the heavy toil. The sigh was heard by Amasis, who, regarding it as an omen, wouldn't allow the chamber to be moved forward any further. Some, however, say that one of the workmen engaged at the levers was crushed and killed by the mass, and that this was the reason of its being left where it now stands. To the other temples of much note, Amasis also made magnificent offerings. At Memphis, for instance, he gave the recumbent Colossus in front of the temple of Hephaestus, which is 75 feet long. 2 other colossal statues stand on the same base, each 20 feet high, carved in the stone of Ethiopia, one on either side of the temple. There's also a stone colossus of the same size at Sais, recumbent like that at Memphis. Amasis finally built the temple of Isis at Memphis, a vast structure, well worth seeing. It's said that the reign of Amasis was the most prosperous time that Egypt ever saw. The river was more liberal to the land, and the land brought forth more abundantly for the service of man than had ever been known before, while the number of inhabited cities was not less than 20,000. It was this king Amasis who established the law that every Egyptian should appear once a year before the governor of his canton and show his means of living, or, failing to do so and to prove that he got an honest livelihood, should be put to death. Solon the Athenian borrowed this law from the Egyptians and imposed it on his countrymen, who have observed it ever since. It's indeed an excellent custom. Amasis was partial to the Greeks, and among other favours which he granted them, gave to such as liked to settle in Egypt the city of Naucratis for their residence. To those who only wished to trade upon the coast and didn't want to fix their abode in the country, he granted certain lands where they might set up altars and erect temples to the gods. Of these temples, the grandest and most famous, which is also the most frequented, is that called the Helenium. It was built conjointly by the Ionians, Dorians, and Aeolians. The following cities taking part in the work: the Ionian states of Chios, Teos, Phocia, and Clazomene, Rhodes, Cnidus, Halicarnassus, and Pharsalus of the Dorians, and Mytilene of the Aeolians. These are the states to whom the temple belongs, and they have the right of appointing the governors of the factory. The other cities which claim a share in the building claim what in no sense belongs to them. 3 nations, however, consecrated for themselves separate temples: the Aeginetans, one to Zeus, the Samians to Hera, and the Milesians to Apollo. In ancient times there was no factory but Naucratis in the whole of Egypt, and if a person entered one of the other mouths of the Nile, he was obliged to swear that he had not come there of his own free will. Having so done, he was bound to sail in his ship to the Canopic mouth, or, were that impossible owing to contrary winds, he must take his wares by boat all round the delta, and so bring them to Naucratis, which had an exclusive privilege. It happened in the reign of Amasis that the temple of Delphi had been accidentally burnt, and the Amphictyons had contracted to have it rebuilt for 300 talents, of which sum 1/4 was to be furnished by the Delphians. Under these circumstances the Delphians went from city to city begging contributions, and among their other wanderings came to Egypt and asked for help. From few other places did they obtain so much. Amasis gave them 1,000 talents of alum, and the Greek settlers 20 minae. A league was concluded by Amasis with the Cyreneans, by which Cyrene and Egypt became close friends and allies. He likewise took a wife from that city, either as a sign of his friendly feeling, or because he had a fancy to marry a Greek woman. However this may be, certain it is that he espoused a lady of Cyrene by name Ladike, daughter, some say, of Battus or Arcesilaus the king, others of Critobulus, one of the chief citizens. When the time came to complete the contract, Amasis was struck with weakness, and he used his other women. Astonished hereat, the king thus addressed his bride: "Woman, thou hast certainly bewitched me. Now therefore be sure thou shalt perish more miserably than ever woman perished yet." Ladike protested her innocence, but in vain. Amasis was not softened. Hereupon she made a vow internally that if he recovered within the day, for no longer time was allowed her, she would present a statue to the temple of Aphrodite at Cyrene. Immediately she obtained her wish, and the king's weakness disappeared. Amasis loved her greatly ever after, and Laodice performed her vow. The statue which he caused to be made and sent to Cyrene continued there to my day, standing with its face looking outwards from the city. Laodice herself, when Cambyses conquered Egypt, suffered no wrong, for Cambyses, on learning of her who she was, sent her back unharmed to her country. Besides the marks of favour already mentioned, Amasis also enriched with offerings many of the Greek temples. He sent to Cyrene a statue of Athena, covered with plates of gold, and a painted likeness of himself. To the Athena of Lindus he gave 2 statues in stone and a linen corselet, well worth inspection. To the Samian Hera he presented 2 statues of himself, made in wood, which stood in the great temple to my day behind the doors. Samos was honoured with these gifts on account of the bond of friendship subsisting between Amasis and Polycrates, the son of Iacches. Lindus, for no such reason, but because of the tradition that the daughters of Danaus touched there in their flight from the sons of Aegyptus, and built the temple of Athena. Such were the offerings of Amasis. He likewise took Cyprus, which no man had ever done before, and compelled it to pay him a tribute.